welcome to the Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Guedu, and Caritas is dedicated to the evolution of consciousness, as our name implies, both individually and also collectively. And this, we promote this evolution by offering a lot of presentations, interviews, classes, study groups on subjects relating to consciousness and also healing, which we've been doing for the past 18 years. However, in 2019, we began recording our presentations, and when the pandemic hit in 2020 or the end of 2019, we went all virtual because we couldn't gather in person. And since then, we've been all virtual and will probably continue to be for the most part. And all of our video recordings are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org. And we upload videos regularly also on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. Our program is made possible by the support of our members and donors. We are a nonprofit, and if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, which I'm sure you will, please consider either making a donation or becoming a member. We would greatly appreciate it. And you can do that on our website, caritascenter.org. And now I want to introduce our speaker. All right. So Carter Phipps is an author, speaker, and thought leader who works at the intersection of business, politics, personal development, and culture. His books include Conscious Leadership, which he co-authored with Whole Foods Market CEO John Mackey and Steve McIntosh, whom we've had on a couple of times. And the other book is Evolutionaries, which I personally loved when I read it some years back. And that is the topic of our talk tonight, of Carter's talk tonight. Carter also hosts the Thinking Ahead podcast and is co-founder and senior fellow of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, a nonprofit social policy think tank. And he lives in Denver, Colorado. And this is the book, Evolutionaries. Oh, I urge you to read it if you haven't yet. And welcome, Carter. Thank you so much for making time to be with us this evening.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. Is that okay? Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, let me know if there's anything changes. Yeah, so it's fun to be on, and it's fun to speak about the Evolutionaries. The book came out in 2012, and so I'm going to try to do. And in some ways, it represented the previous decade of my life and my explorations. I was an editor of a magazine called What is Enlightenment in that era, and the book was sort of a culmination of that era of my life. And in the last era of my life, I've done, I've been a little bit more involved in the political world and the business world than I was previously. And in the political world, I co-founded the Institute for Cultural Evolution with Steve McIntosh and Jeff Salzman, who both, I think, spoken on this forum. And that has been to try to overcome polarization and try to have an impact on our politically polarized society by using a new way of thinking about politics. So I'm going to try to combine these two worlds tonight. One is this evolutionary, the rise of the evolutionaries. And I want to communicate like what that means to me and some of the things that were in my book, some of the insights that were in my book. And then I'm going to kind of switch and show you, try to demonstrate how that can have an impact on how we think about politics today, even in the most present realities of our polarized world. What can we do? How do we think about it? How can that way of being and thinking and those insights have an impact on this world? All right. So I'm going to share my screen now. It's fun to present. Ironically, my new book, Conscious Leadership, came out in the middle of the pandemic. But what I didn't present a lot on it. I did like 1 million podcasts. So I got very used to doing podcasts, but I haven't done a lot of presentations like this. So it's a little different. So hopefully I'll get this right. And of course, when Evolutionaries came out, that was a long time ago, before any of this was happening.
Yeah.
All right, good. So everyone can see that? Mm-hmm. The Rise of the Evolutionaries. So that's my little, we'll cover the book. So this goes back in some respects to an era in my own life, really the early 2000s, when I was editor of What is Enlightenment magazine, and part of a spiritual community. And we began to notice a couple things. One, there was this new movement at the time that was broadly called the integral movement. And we began to make a lot of, and I began to know a lot of people in that world. And Ken Wilber, if you know who Ken Wilber, a philosopher, was at the center of that movement. And he was drawing on this past group of thinkers to speak about this new integral movement. So that's one idea, this new integral movement. And then another thing was happening as well. We were, in the magazine I work for, we were realizing and appreciating and exploring this history of what we called sort of evolutionary thinking. And by this, I don't just mean Darwin. I mean, when the idea of evolution arose in the late, really 17th century and 18th century and early 19th century, it immediately began to transform the way we think, not just about science, but the way we think about everything, really. The way we think about culture, the way we think about all kinds of subjects. And when I talk about an evolutionary, I'm talking about people who have let that truth about our evolving world sink in very deeply into their bones. And it's transforming the way they see the world. And they're beginning to think, to literally think with an evolutionary lens. And part of that is even the transformation of how we see spirituality and religion and mysticism. All right, so that's just a little prelude. So the rise of the evolutionaries, I'm going to talk, if you go, this was a quote from John Dewey, and it's just a beautiful expression of really what I just said. And he says, in laying hands upon the sacred ark of absolute permanency, in treating the form that had been regarded as types of fixity and perfection as originating and passing away, the origin of species introduced a mode of thinking that in the end was bound to transform the logic of knowledge and hence the treatment of morals, politics, and religion. So that just gives you a sense of like this idea comes into culture, that the idea of permanency that had been part of that sort of steady state universe, and the sense of the religious worldview that had underlied culture. We didn't have a sense of deep time. We didn't have a sense of how old the earth was, right? These are all things that are starting to percolate into culture. And suddenly all these things that have just been the way it is, suddenly we realize aren't the way it is. It's a temporary moment in the history of culture, and it will be different in the future. It was different in the past, and we're part of this stream of becoming, right? And that realization is a very powerful realization for culture and for how we think. But I also would suggest it's just a powerful realization for any of us to think about our own lives that way, to think about the world around us that way. It just changes. It changes so much. In the book, I use the metaphor of an earthquake. It's almost like an earthquake underneath us because everything gets shaken. And the term I use in the book is called breaking the spell of solidity. This sense that there's a solid world beneath us, that things are relatively fixed and static and unchanging or cyclical. And then we realize they're not so fixed and they're not so static and they're maybe not so cyclical even those cycles can happen. there is this forward movement that we're part of, and it's very powerful. Like we are moving forward in this massive flow of history, of culture, of biology, and even we've realized over the last years of cosmology. I mean, we're not in a steady state universe. We're in the Big Bang. The universe has a beginning. We are toward so a lot of part of what I do in the book is I just explore like what does that mean, and this is one of my kind of favorite ways of expressing it. You keep trying to find new ways to capture this truth. And one of the things I love about this is one of a painting from the Renaissance. So if you look at that top painting, one of the things that is captured there is in the Renaissance, they started to use these new sense of spatial perspective, right? I was just in Florence, actually. I was just in Italy. And so I was looking at some of the Renaissance and exploring, thinking a lot about the Renaissance. And you're having this breakthrough in that era, and partially hearkening back to the Roman and Greek eras, but they're starting to think about spatial relationships in a different way. It's the emergence of that Renaissance mind. And what I say is it's sort of a revolution in changing how we think landscapes of spatial perspective. And with this emergence of the Renaissance and of the kind of modern world, and later on we'll get to the Enlightenment and a full-blown modernism, right? With this emergence, it changes the way we see changes the way we see space in almost every dimension, right? I mean, we go from these mostly local worldviews, people didn't travel that far, to starting to have it in just a few hundred years, starting to think about the earth as an entity, the earth itself. Most people did a map of the whole earth. I mean, we didn't have that until fairly recently in human history. And then you go forward in another 100 years, we start to have a map of our solar system, and then a map of the galaxy, and then a map of the cosmos. I mean, like in a mere few hundred years, you go from maybe understanding like the geological sort of landscape around where you live, and you maybe hear about places somewhere else, to this incredible sense of spatial explosion in our mind, right? So I call this like transforming the way we think about landscapes of spatial perspective. So then comes the idea of evolution in the 19th century, and this idea of this unfolding, not spatially, but temporally, right? Temporally. That's different. We have this. So in the same way that our understanding of space has exploded over the last years, just changed who we are. I mean, on all kinds of levels. My suggestion is that our understanding of time is exploding right now and changing who we are on all kinds of levels, and is going to continue to, and has certainly been doing that for the last couple hundred years, really last 150 years, particularly since Darwin. With the emergence of Darwin, like evolution sort of landed on the cultural map and broke up our sense of time in this massive and significant way. So in the Renaissance, we're talking about landscapes of spatial perspective, right? What I'm talking about is timescapes of developmental perspective, right? So timescapes over time, this cognizing timescapes and cognizing this sense of something happening in those timescapes, something's evolving, something's developing in those timescapes, right? So timescapes of developmental perspective. That is a very powerful way to think about life, a way to think about human cognition, a way to think about human culture, a way to think about biology, a way to think about cosmology, right? I mean, I said that just a minute ago, but it's so true. So now I always like to say, if you take the two expressions of what these two perspectives, the spatial and the temporal, how, what they ultimately mean about the human, it captures something very interesting, I think, because what we realize now, if we take our modern science into view, if you think spatially, where are we situated as humans, right? We are just this little third rock from the sun in a solar system, in a galaxy with billions of stars and millions of solar systems, probably. Yeah, I can't do the numbers, but they're big. And in a galaxy with, God knows how many galaxies, billions and billions and trillions of stars in the universe. And we're just this infinitesimal little bit of it in this little rock, right? So you can imagine what that does, the existential reality of that truth, very different than how we might have perceived ourselves 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, right? That's existentially sort of crushing or liberating. I don't know, it could be both, right? But it's existentially very powerful. I remember it can be liberating too, right? The insignificance can at times be liberating. This is a slightly side story, but I remember when I was, when I grew up in the 80s, and I was in that era when, my parent, you can be anything you want to be. And, I think my era, my generation of kids like today was sort of raised with a great sense of sort of self-importance, and I remember the first time I traveled in India in the early 90s, I remember being in a train station I guess I was in the South India in this train station. I was traveling, I was alone. And I remember there were so many people in this train station. Of course, my perception, it wasn't entirely true, I'm sure, but my perception at the time was like, for the first time in my life, I felt completely anonymous. Now, I'm sure I wasn't actually anonymous. I was American traveling to India, but I was just part of the masses, part of the masses. And there was something incredibly liberating, I remember, about just being one of the mass, just part of the sea of humanity. And there was something, so that can be liberating too, right? And it was very, very powerful after growing up in the West, in which you never felt that in that way. So anyway, that's a bit of a side note. But so let's take the temporal piece, right? So that's the spatial piece. The temporal piece is different, right? The temporal piece, we are at the evolving edge of a massive 13.7 billion year process that has given rise to planets, to geology, to the periodic table of elements, to all the biological systems we know, to DNA, to the complexity of mammals and life in all its dimensions, and ultimately to the complexity of our mind and to human cognition and to the human brain, which is the most complex thing we know of by that in the universe. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying it's the most, as far as we know. That puts us in a very different position. That puts us at the sort of hurtling out into the future, at the leading edge, sort of. It positions us at the edge of this evolving, what? We don't know exactly, but this evolving universe in some extraordinary way. We are an expression of it. We are, in the words of Jesuit mystic Teilhard de Chardin, we are evolution itself kind of become conscious of itself. We are the product so far of this 13.7 billion year evolutionary process. That places us in a very different position. So I love those two, the sort of crushing insignificance and the, oh my God, incredible importance almost. And I think in that mix is a great expression. If we get too much of one, we probably lose perspective. We get too much of the other, we probably lose perspective. So it's nice to have that combo. But that positions us very differently. It makes us think about the future differently. It makes us think about the past differently. It makes us think about our role in that position very, very differently. So the people who, let me just go. So two of the people who in some ways begin to capture some of these ideas are two of my own sort of personal hero visionaries. You may have heard of them before, but there are a number of people. These two aren't the only one. They're just two who happen to express this in a very powerful way. And it kind of fits because one's from the East, one's from the West. One's a Catholic, one's a Hindu. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit priest and paleontologist and Jesuit mystic who wrote a famous book called The Phenomenon of Man, or later translated as The Human Phenomenon. And Sri Aurobindo was the leader of the Indian independence movement before Gandhi and was put in jail by the British, had a very powerful spiritual awakening, and was exiled to a French section of India called Pondicherry and lived there the rest of his life and wrote these beautiful kind of mystical writings in which he expressed this also deep time evolutionary view of the spiritual life as well. And they both captured that, starting to think in this developmental way, right? Starting to think developmentally, awakening to those temporal timescapes, right? Those developmental timescapes. There, you could feel it. Their minds were blown, but not just with the mysticism of the time or of the past, right? People can get very, you read Meister Eckhart, he's lit up with the mysticism of being, right? That's a beautiful thing, right? That kind of enlightenment. You read Ramana Maharshi, lit up with the mysticism of being. These guys are lit up with the mysticism of becoming. Very different thing and very powerful in its own way. Here's my breaking the spell solidity. So you can talk about one of my favorite, just some quotes. I mean, read it in their quotes. So I'm just going to read this quote here. It says, the man whose eyes have been opened will make his way back into the sealed depths of nature. There he will peer down into the vast tangle of branches that supports him and disappears into the far distance below him, lost in the heart of the dim past. And once again, he will fill his soul to overflowing as he contemplates and vibrates in sympathy with a single-minded and determined movement, which is written into a series of dead layers and the present distribution of all living beings. If he then looks upward to the wide areas that wait for new creations, he will consecrate himself, body and soul, with newly strengthened faith to a progress which draws or sweeps along even those who reject it. I mean, there are very few people who can express themselves like Teilhard de Chardin. And, but he was one of those figures who you can feel he's lit up with this developmental view, this evolutionary vision. And now he has a Christian version of it. Aurobindo has a Hindu version of it, but he's lit up with it too. If it be true that apparent nature is secret God, he has a whole thing about nature and spirit and God and this evolutionary vision. And they're lit up with it. It's like they've had some kind of awakening to this perspective where they're seeing things in this developmental way. And so that's part of what I'm trying to communicate tonight, but part of what in Evolutionaries, I was trying to communicate that sense. There's a new perspective, a new awakening available. That's not the spiritual awakening of the past, or at least it's not only that. It's another way of it's a way of seeing and cognizing culture and reality and nature. That's almost like a version of nature mysticism, but not the nature mysticism of Wordsworth, because it has this developmental view. It has this evolutionary view. It has this temporal unfolding piece of it. It's like you see it, and you'll talk to people in Evolutionaries. When I interviewed all these people, you see it. They have these awakenings. So many of the people, they had a moment where it's like they start to have this, this part of them awakens to this unfolding vision. Teilhard is just like he's like the patron saint of that vision. I mean, he just it kind of screams off every page that he writes. So Teilhard was very influenced by Henri Bergson. And Henri Bergson was a French philosopher who also was lit up with this kind of vision. And in a different context, a Western philosophical context, more. But he also, this is one of my favorite quotes from him. Remember, I talked about breaking that spell of solidity, that sense that things are solid and static and unchanging and just the same today and tomorrow. And when you wake up to this kind of evolutionary vision, you think, oh my God, no, we're part of this process. This is unfolding. We are living this process. My body's an expression of it. My mind's an expression of it. And I'm in the midst of it. So this is one of my favorite quotes from him. I talk about this in the book. It says, life in general is mobility itself. Particular manifestations of life accept this mobility reluctantly and constantly lag behind. It is always going ahead. They want to mark time. Evolution in general would fain go in a straight line. Each special evolution is a kind of circle. Like eddies of dust raised by the wind as it passes, the living turn upon themselves, borne up by the great blast of life. They are therefore relatively stable and counterfeit immobility so well that we treat each of them as a thing rather than as a progress, forgetting that the very permanence of their form is only the outline of a movement, that the very permanence of their form is only the outline of a movement. At times, however, in a fleeting vision, the invisible breath that bears them is materialized before our eyes, allowing us a glimpse of the fact that the living being is above all a thoroughfare, and that the essence of life is in the movement by which life is transmitted. So, I mean, again, he's writing 100 years ago, and in a very different era and a different time, but you see that vision of like, oh my God, this awakening to this, this idea that we see life we so often, and especially in a kind of when we thinking of spatial, I was talking about spatial perspectives earlier. We see things in space, and there are things in space, right? But what we often don't see is processes in time, right? So we're a thing in space, right? And that's a very easy thing. We can walk around, I can introduce myself to you, and we can say, well, I'm a thing in space, you're a thing in space, right? And that's all well and good. But sometimes the more subtle piece of what we are, and I would argue the more recent revelation of what we are and what life is it's a process in time. And we're processes in time. And when we start to see life and nature and culture and humans and ourselves and our brain and our thinking as processes in time, something happens. Something changes how we relate to the future and to the past. It's a form of awakening. It's a form of revelation. And you can feel it and you can sense it in these guys, the very permanence of their form, the seeming stability is only the outline of a movement. And I just love that. And I love the dust devil because I grew up in Oklahoma and there's all kinds of dust devils. So I particularly like that dust devil. All right. And so just to kind of put a little bow on this, in the book, this is a quote from my book. I talk about the way this transforms spirituality, this conception of thinking and cognizing in developmental time. I say evolutionary spirituality is why I refer to that as, is an evolution-inspired, world-embracing, and future-oriented. It's a creative, anticipatory spiritual path in which salvation, however we define that word, is to be found not in connection to the ancestral spirits of yesteryear, in promises of a heavenly beyond, in achieving a transcendent state of inner peace, or even in letting go into a timeless present, but in fully embracing the emergent potential contained in the depths of an evolving cosmos, right? So that gets at what's different about it. It's not that those other things, those are all legitimate and powerful ways of experiencing the revelation of spirit in some form. They're not, it doesn't make them wrong or bad, but there's another version, another powerful way of thinking about the future and about spirit, which is in fully embracing the emergent potential contained in the depths of an evolving cosmos. Thinking in developmental time. That's the piece I really want you to kind of think about. What would that look like? How do I think about the world if I embrace that? Okay, so I don't think we have time for that. So these are just some evolutionary principles. But honestly, I think if I get into these, that's going to be the end of that's going to be the rest of the talk right there. So you can look at them if you want. But what I really want to do, these are just, anyway, you can read them. But so that's one piece. Now I want to give you another piece of another emerging aspect of what we might call an integral worldview. I know people have talked to you probably about integral, but I talked about evolutionary, but there's also this integral. And in some ways, they're pointing to a similar revelation, a similar way of thinking, but maybe capturing two different aspects of it. So I've been talking about that evolutionary aspect, that thinking in developmental time. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about maybe the more integral aspect of it, which also can include evolution, certainly. Ken Wilber talks about the integral stage of consciousness, what he talks about as the integral awakening, as in one form and one way of thinking about it is a new way of seeing the world, what he calls vision logic. I can't remember where he got vision logic from. I'm not sure that's his term, but he was inspired certainly by Aurobindo, by Teilhard de Chardin, by Jean Gebser, who we will speak about, by Alfred North Whitehead, and other people who were alive with this evolutionary vision. But there's another aspect of it. And this aspect it's a way of cognizing that is not just formal logic, but it's grasping ideas, grokking them, to use a term from the 70s, 60s, I think. Robert Heinlein, I think that's grokking them or grasping them as a whole. But not just as a blob, as a whole in which you can see the relationships between them, right? So be able to grasp them as a whole. He really captures that in this quote. He said, where the formal mind establishes higher and creative relationship, vision logic establishes networks of those relationships. The point is to place each proposition alongside numerous others, so as to be able to see or to vision how the truth or falsity of any one proposition would affect would affect the truth or falsity of all the others. Such panoramic or vision logic apprehends a mass network or ideas, how they influence each other, what their relationships are. It is thus the beginning of a truly higher order synthesizing capacity of making connections, relating truths, coordinating ideas, integrating concepts, right? So this isn't just like normal logic, right? So I don't know what I did there, but I changed. Anyway, this is fine. So it's not just normal logic, right? This is a higher order of logic. And you can see with some of these evolutionaries I was talking about, they're alive with this way of seeing. There's something very powerful. Like if you say, like, at a certain point in the history of culture, our capacity to have that kind of abstract logical thinking was a very powerful breakthrough. Probably we can discuss when it came online and how it evolved in culture. But 3,000 years ago, we might not have had the ability to really do abstract logic in the way we do now. That was something that emerged at some point in human history. And so the idea is this vision logic, this way of seeing is is something that is emerging now in human history, or the last few hundred years of human history. And some people are waking up to that way of seeing. So again, it's like a form of awakening. You can see these evolutionaries, they're alive with it. They're excited about it. It's like, it's like they can see in a new way and put things together. It's like temporally and spatially, but not just, sometimes we can grok a beautiful picture or for nature, but this is also seeing the relationships between things and being able to not lose the complexity of a picture, even as we're looking at the whole thing. And that's a very unique way of seeing. One of the individuals who really also captures this is Jean Gebser, who talks about the integral structure of awareness. And again, he says an aspect of integral awareness is the presentation or making present all the various structures of awareness. We're going to talk about what that means later. Rather than allowing one, the rational structure, to be valid, all structures are recognized, presented one through the other. The awareness of and acceptance of all the various structures enables one to live through the various structures rather than to be subjected to them. Now, I'm going to come back to that because that's confusing because I haven't really introduced that. I apologize for that. I'm going to come back to it. But so Aurobindo, right? We talked about Aurobindo and his evolutionary vision, but he had the same kind of thing. He had a vision of what he called the higher mind. And this is a more spiritually described version, but he says a mind no longer of mingled light and obscurity or half light, but a large clarity of the spirit. Its basic substance is a Unitarian sense of being with a powerful multiple dynamization capable of the formation of a multitude of aspects of knowledge, ways of actions, forms and significance of becoming. Its special character, its activity of consciousness are dominated by thought. It is a luminous thought mind, a mind of spirit-born conceptual knowledge. So you can see he had quite a way of expressing himself. It's not always easy to understand. But again, this kind of higher vision way of seeing, right? And one more, I love Teilhard de Chardin. He talks about seeing. Sometimes in his letters, he's so alive with it. You can almost feel it jumping off the page. It's like he can sense that he sees in a new way. So he says, seeing. One could say that the whole of life lies in seeing, if not ultimately, at least essentially. To be more is to be more united. You notice the unification. They all talk about united. And this sums up and is the very conclusion of the work to follow. But unity grows, and we will affirm this again, and only if it's supported by an increase of consciousness, of vision. This is probably why the history of the living world can be reduced to the elaboration of ever more perfect eyes at the heart of the cosmos, where it is always possible to discern more, and not the perfection of an animal or the supremacy of the thinking being measured by the penetration and power of synthesis of their glance. Again, synthesis. To try to see more and to see better is not, therefore, just a fantasy, a curiosity, or a luxury. See or perish. This is a situation imposed on every element of the universe by the mysterious gift of existence. And thus, to a higher degree, this is the human condition. So again, this idea of seeing. So sometimes I think, like, if you take the history of the emergence of the modern world, thinking becomes preeminent, IQ, and it's all about, how smart you are, how sophisticated can you think, right? IQ is the currency of the sort of much of the modern world. And then we have this reaction to that over the last 30, 40, 50 years where feeling becomes more important, right? It's not about thinking. Thinking is so superficial, and people will say, no, it's not about thinking. Yeah, okay, you're smart, but can you feel? How deep are your emotional world, right? We don't have IQ, we have EQ, we have emotional intelligence, right? The liberation of our emotional worlds and the subjectivity of emotional worlds has been a project of the last decades, right? And it's become important, it's become relevant, and we've all become more emotionally intelligent as a result, or not all of us, but some of us have become more emotionally intelligent as a result, right? But I feel like Teilhard is combining in his idea of seeing, he's combining thinking and feeling, right? He's combining those two into seeing. They're both, it's both thinking and feeling. You're feeling into life, but you're also cognizing. And so that's the idea. That's that vision logic notion I want to capture. So those two elements, I in the book I talk about the qualities of an evolutionary, and these are the qualities I list in the book. I list 3. Now I'm sure I can list a lot more, but I chose 3. One of them you can see is what I spoke about first. Evolutionaries are starting to think in developmental time. That explosion of temporal life and thinking of life through temporal lens. Evolutionaries have an integral focus, right? They think across disciplines. They're integrating knowledge, right? And the third is, I said, this sense of optimism. Now, I haven't talked about this, and we don't have to go into this, but I do feel there's some quality when people awaken to this evolutionary perspective. There's this kind of sense of possibility that emerges. Not like everything's going to be great, or anything like that. It may not be, but this sense of an awakening of agency around life, around oneself, around culture, a sense that my agency and this larger picture of culture, nature, are connected. And in my own very small way, I am participating in that. And there's something beautiful about that reality, that even it just, there's a certain optimism. If you think of the history, where we've come from, where we've evolved out of, the primordial whatever, slime, ooze, or whatever, 50,000 years of human evolution. Yeah, we made a lot of mistakes along the way, but it's a pretty remarkable journey. 10,000 years. It's a pretty remarkable journey. We may mess it up. Still, we could, we are more capable today of messing up maybe than we've ever been, because we have this technology. But it's a heck of a journey, and seeing that journey through the lens of an evolutionary is inherently, I think, to feel a sense of possibility about the future and about where we can go and where we can head, and that sense that you can, in some small way, just by deeply considering these ideas, by embracing them, by engaging with them, we're participating in that struggle to go forward. And there's no guarantees. I don't have any guarantees. But I think there is a deep optimism in that vision. All right. So now I'm going to pivot to politics. I know that sounds funny, but I'm going to pivot to politics. But before I do that, I'm going to just stop there and take questions about this. And if we want to dialogue a little about this, I'm happy to. And then I'm going to try to kind of give you a sense of why these two ways of thinking are so important in terms of thinking about our politics today. All right.
Oh, hi, I'm Edna. I used to live near Boulder. Now I'm in New Mexico. I read your book. I forgot all about reading it. and I really liked it, but I don't remember it very well. I'm taking Gloria's course on Spiritism. I hope these things kind of join together because, well, I think I'm an evolutionary, but I get discouraged because I have lots of ideas and I think I can make things, or things that would be good, but then I give up and like nothing's happening. But I think through Gloria, maybe I could learn there might be helpers out there and not to give up too soon. Well, like last week I gave Tim Jackson's book to the mayor here that's running for mayor, and he wanted to build a soccer stadium. I can't remember, $50 million or something. And so I gave him the book and a little note that says, this may not be the best use of the money, Like there's some other things that might, anyway, I don't know if he's going to read the book or my letter, but like I just have to have faith that at some point it might pop up in his consciousness. So
It might.
anyway, I just wondered what you thought about like trying to keep optimistic, even though you might be naturally that, but things don't happen.
Well, yeah, definitely. I think the optimism, it's always hard sometimes. Obviously, we're facing challenges to be optimistic, and all of us go through periods where we can be less, have less confidence in maybe the future we see or what's happening around us. And I worry about culture and politics in all kinds of ways. But I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is almost like this deeper sense that, oh my God, we may go through all kinds of problems, there are problems out there, but there's this larger vision, history is not really one damn thing after the other, as I think Mark Twain said, or something like that. It's like, it's like there's a view of history that's just the same old. And of course, we do repeat things, and there are cycles to history. And sometimes it seems like humans don't change, and sometimes it seems like nothing changes at all. But then you look actually at other moments, and you realize that, oh my God, things have changed so much. From the time when I was a kid, I'm sure the time when you were young, culture has changed so much, and I think all of us can say that to some degree.
Yeah.
And it's really important to keep that picture alive in our hearts, even as we we may be frustrated about all kinds of things. But if we see this larger trend of history, and it doesn't promise anything about what's going to happen over the next, but there is this kind of, you start to see, oh my God, we're all part of this incredible, unfolding. And there's something beautiful about that. And there's a kind of deep optimism about that. I can't promise you a today and tomorrow optimism. But I can maybe offer a deeper layer of optimism.
Well, maybe it's kind of faith. I mean, I'm not religious or anything in the normal sense, but
yeah.
But to keep going, you have to have faith that something will emerge.
Yeah, I think, and you never know when. It may not be in our lifetimes. Maybe you're working for something that's not in your lifetime or my lifetime. You don't know. But right. There is something beautiful about that. You're participating in this larger thing. That you're not disconnected from it. We're connected to it. We're in the middle of it.
Yeah, and, I agree.
Teilhard talked about this beautiful thing called faith in the future. And he talks about faith in the future, and there's something beautiful about that. So to me, good. That kind of faith can coexist with a lot of frustration in the moment. That's also true, so.
Mm-hmm. I think seeing it in an evolutionary trajectory, as an evolutionary trajectory, then some of the things that seem so onerous can be seen kind of as labor pains. At least that's how I often think of them,
That's true, right?
And instead of, we're doomed and we're going to hell in a handbasket, if you look at it as an evolutionary developmental pattern of things, where is this leading, and how can we help direct it in the right direction, and channel these energies in the right direction? It helps to see it as that larger worldview.
Amen. Yeah. And it's like, as some people say, there's probably, amen. I couldn't agree more. That's you I think you're making my point for me. I love it. It's so true. Mm. There's something also about just, realize also, there's probably no other time in history most of us would rather live, I mean, at what point would, as someone said, not before anesthetic, I mean, there are, there's no real wars in the Western Hemisphere right now. I mean, that, over the last decade, that probably hasn't been true for who knows how long. There aren't any great power wars, or haven't been for, many decades. There are a lot of problems in the world, and, sometimes we see them more and more urgently and intensively because of modern communications. But sometimes we easily lose track of all the things that are also improving. So I'm not here to tell you it's all rosy, but I do think sometimes we miss those developmental longer term trajectories if we don't occasionally stop and pay attention to them. And that's part of thinking in that developmental time. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question in Fort Collins.
Fort Collins, cool.
Can you hear me? You can't
Yeah.
see me.
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Good. My name is Larry. I'm friends with Kara. And you were making several comments and trying to connect cosmology, spirituality, and evolution. And I wonder if some of your evolutionary principles, you listed about 10 of them on one of your slides, if those principles would need modification depending on the cosmological constant that right now says that the universe is expanding. What if it were not expanding? Would that affect any of your evolutionary principles?
Well, I mean, I obviously we all have to evolve as science evolves. So, right now, the way the universe, the picture of the universe we have is this unfolding, ever complexifying picture of 13.7 billion year process. And it may be that maybe this is just one little cosmic evolution universe in the mid, and maybe there's millions of universes that are born and die and we don't know about. The cosmological picture may look quite different than we realize now, but I think what we see now is this expanding, evolving, cosmological evolving universe, and we can speak to that. Now, independent of the universe, we definitely see that when we look at what's happening on this planet and the evolution of this planet over the last 5 billion years. We see biological evolution, we see cultural evolution. That's not that's something that is happening and is true, whatever the ultimate fate of our science of cosmology. So yeah, I mean, we always have to respond to the science as it presents itself to us and understand that it's going to change.
Yeah, I think I asked a tough question, trying to connect physical cosmology to some extent spirituality.
Well, I think I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That was definitely difficult to cross boundaries from one to the other. And then you mentioned,
I don't see a difference. I think it's all connected. It's all one. It's if once we glimpse the reality behind cosmology or spirituality, it's the same essential oneness and truth. And I don't separate cosmology from spirituality.
Well, maybe we need a definition of spirituality. Maybe that would help Larry.
Maybe.
So how about a definition?
Well, there's a book out called The Three Big Bangs, which is also a kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, which is there's the Big Bang of matter, right? Of the universe. There's that initiated the universe. There's the Big Bang of life that started the process of life at some point. We don't quite know, but something happened to burst into being life, this thing called life. And then there's the Big Bang of our minds, right? To give us the kind of agency that we have, that it was unprecedented. There was nothing like that for 1 billion years on the planet. Nothing like us, totally different. And you can see the moment we emerge, the planet completely changes because we become the dominant life form. Boom. In the evolutionary terms, overnight, right? Culture explodes. And in 50,000 years, not that much has happened. It's been a relatively slow process for 1 billion or for 500 million or whatever. I mean, lots of life and similar in different forms and stuff. And then we happen in culture, boom, we take over the planet and the culture explodes. It's like, so that's something new. So evolution keeps presenting these new things, right? These new vistas, these new spaces. Evolution, one of the principles is evolution itself evolves. It keeps evolving in not just in linear ways, but it keeps opening up these entirely new spaces for evolution to occur. Culture is an entirely new space for evolution to unfold, right? There was nothing like this whole unfolding dimension of human culture before humans. I mean, animals have their own bits in culture, but it's mostly rooted in their biology. But with humans, something totally different. And so evolution, it keeps creating these sort of, these kinds of miracles of opportunity. And that was a miracle of opportunity, this new opportunity space for evolution to happen. DNA was like that. When DNA evolved, right, suddenly you have this explosion of life forms, right? And all these life forms emerge and these new. So evolution has these incredible breakthroughs. But now evolution is related to what we do and think and say and act, right? It's no longer happening unconsciously, right? That's the whole conscious evolution idea. There's something, it's too deeply tied up with our agency. And so at this point, we have to, part of it, I always say it's like if you're driving down the road and you're trying to steer your car, but your eyes are closed, right? And you don't know, you're asleep, you have a lot of wrecks because you don't know where you're going. You're going somewhere, but you don't know where you're going. So us becoming aware of evolution and of this process we're part of is sort of like waking up when we're already going down the road, we're already in the car, and we have our feet on the accelerator, and we're waking up. And of course, we're still having a lot of wrecks. But the opportunity here is to drive the car. That's the metaphysical moment of this century and probably the next century, is to start to drive the car in a more in a more conscious way. All right,
Carter.
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Yeah,
I'm Larry in Fort Collins again. You can't see me.
Yeah, hi Larry.
Hey, one of the really hot research topics in physical cosmology these days is dark matter and dark energy, which are big topics to me. Have you thought about those and incorporated any of them into your evolutionary principles?
I'm not an astro. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an astrophysicist, and I love Carl Sagan. I used to read astrophysics books when I was a kid. I love astrophysics, but I'm not an astrophysicist, so I don't have. I'm as curious as anyone about the mysteries of physics and the mysteries of dark matter and dark energy and what physics, how it's going to evolve in the future and what it's going to say about these things. I think it's fascinating, but I don't have a dog in that fight. I mean, I'm not, I don't know.
No, one more, Carter. You said humans are evolving for 50,000 years. Human evolution for 50,000 years. Isn't that a little short?
It's short for biological evolution. But don't you think culture's changed in the last 50,000 years?
Of course. But I just thought human evolution has occurred for hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, or even more.
Human biological evolution goes way back and is continuing. But my proposition was that evolution, in addition to the biological evolution, which is continuing, it opened up a new vista of evolution, which is culture. And now culture is a very powerful form of evolution. And in some ways, it even can impact biological evolution, right? So culture is a new domain, a new space in which we are evolving. That's where most of human evolution is taking place now, in human culture. Biological evolution is comparatively very slow. That's what I mean.
But it seems like in culture, there's always it's like two steps forward and one step back. Every time there is an evolutionary change in culture, there's tremendous pushback, usually in any culture, to the next evolutionary stage, which is very discouraging.
We're certainly seeing that now.
So I think that's a perfect segue. So I'm going to just give a little talk here, and you may have heard some of this before, but and we can, how are we doing on time, by the way?
We have one more hour. It's 6:30 Colorado time.
Okay. Okay,
Can I
great.
just make
So,
a real quick comment that really
Yeah.
fits in here?
Yeah.
Just to support the things you're saying, I just started reading this book this week by Jeremy Lent. It's called The Patterning Instinct, and I really
Yes.
recommend it. He's saying just what you're saying, that this is a cultural evolution, and the book, I have not read that much, but it's about linking science and ancient wisdom, which I guess you could say spirituality or oneness. But and anyway, if anybody wants to kind of, I mean, it's like 500 pages, so it'll be good reading for anybody. So
I
okay,
have that
sorry
book
to
somewhere.
interrupt, but
It's somewhere back here.
Oh,
I have not read it though, I confess. I haven't.
okay. It's actually easy to read. It's a little bit too casual for me, but it's very casual, easy reading.
Oh, that's good.
And he
You're
borrows
tough.
ideas.
You're
from
tough.
people.
That's good. You want some serious books. That's good. I like that.
Yeah. Okay. Back to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah. So this issue of culture, right? So keep in mind this evolutionary, vision and this integral vision, right? We need both those as we try to understand human cultural evolution, right? Because if we want to have, so the idea here is that, and this was an idea that a number of people have presented, including the idea of spiral dynamics, which people and integral have, and a number of other systems of thought have noticed that, evolution doesn't just happen in, straight forms, right? It culturally, and it happens often in certain dynamic equilibriums form, certain structures form that we might call like stages form, just like a child goes through. I was just writing about this the other day. A child goes through certain stages of their development, right? They're not fixed stages. They don't stay there forever. And everyone's a little different. Every child's a little different, but we can kind of map them. We say they're in this is how their mind is developing. It goes through this phase. This is how they're thinking in this phase of their development. And then they move off that, dynamic equilibrium or whatever, and they move to another, It's almost like what, some people have talked about punctuated equilibriums. These periods of maybe relatively stasis and these periods where things seem to move forward. So in culture, the integral, pioneers like Ken Wilber and like other people have noticed that, there does seem to be these worldviews that form in history that become very dominant, these fundamental ways of organizing reality that become very strong, and they inform us for a period of time, right? And then they sometimes fade away and give rise to a new way of organizing reality, a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding reality, right? And so we can see that happen. The one that everyone points to, of course, is the emergence of science and the emergence of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and the emergence, and to some extent, you see maybe an early version of that with the Renaissance, and maybe even an early version of that with the Greeks and Romans, right? You see the earliest glimpses of science and math, and a kind of a democracy, and even those early, and then you see it reemerge maybe a little bit in the Renaissance, and then you see it come back in the Enlightenment, and it really comes into culture full-throated and full-hearted in the late 19th century, in the 1800s and the 19th and the 19th century, the 1700s and the 1800s, right? And academics call this the emergence of modernism, right? Modernism, that's the term that's generally used. And they contrast that to what came before, which was, I'm going to call it traditional culture, right? But it's often religious culture. Some people just say, well, this is science. There was religion, and then there was science, right? Now, I would say that, that's a little too oversimplifying. but there was some form of culture that emerged at a certain form, of which religion and a traditional form of religion is an expression of that form of culture, right? So some theorists have noticed that in about 500 BC to maybe about 1000 AD, there were all the world's major religions formed, right? In that era, right? They didn't form later. They didn't form, all the main ones that became dominant in the next era formed in that period. They call it people call it the axial age, right? The age in which the human culture turned on an axis. That's what it means, the axial age. And it sort of seemed to be very strong. In 500 BC, you have like 4 of the world's major religions are formed in that era, right? You have Buddha and Plato and Socrates and Zoroaster and Jainism and you have, and I think Confucius, it's Confucius, I can't remember but Lao Tzu is in that era too, right? So you have these emergence of all these mystics who are the kind of progenitors of these religious eras in that same era. So something was happening, something was in the water, right, in that era. Something was happening. There was this emergence happened. This new structure, new worldview was emerging, I would argue. This new way of thinking about the world was emerging. It took a long time for it to become dominant, but eventually it did become dominant, this kind of more traditional worldview. And there was probably something before that. We don't have to map all of cultural evolution right now, but I'm just saying there was this traditional worldview, and it emerged at some point in history, and it often is religious. It doesn't have to be religious, I would argue, right? It has, these worldviews have a kind of core DNA, a core way of organizing reality, and they can express themselves in many different ways, right? So you have this traditional worldview, and then it gives way to this modern worldview. Now, what happens with that? We get science, technology, democracy, right? We get individuality in a whole new way. We get, just the world changes, the world pivots, the world goes through more changes over the last 250 years than it went through in the previous 2000, right? Because of technology and because of the way in which we organize our world, right? Human population explodes, right? Medicine changes. All of that, I would suggest, is a function of this new modernist worldview coming online, right? And people embracing it. Now, the traditional worldview didn't go away, right? It didn't disappear. People are still religious. It mixed and intermingled with this new modern worldview. Some people stayed very strongly in their old traditions, and some people embraced modernity, right? This new way of thinking, and there's an overlap, right? So we have that traditional and modern worldview, which for the last couple hundred years, all the culture wars, more or less, were between that traditional way of seeing things and that modern way of seeing things. The evolution battles, right? The classic evolution battles, Inherit the Wind and all the evolution battles from the early 20th century. They're all a traditional worldview fighting against this emerging modern worldview. And that emerging modern worldview, that scientific worldview, we call it scientific worldview, but it's really more than that. But the scientific worldview, fighting for its place against, what Carl Sagan called a demon-haunted world, right? That old world, that traditional world that we don't want to go back to in his mind, right? So one of the principles that some of these integral systems begin to notice is that there are good, and this was a breakthrough, right? It began to notice that worldviews as a way of organizing society may have come later on in our cultural journey, but they're not bad or good so much. There are good things about them, very healthy things about them, and there can be pathologies about them, right? They can have great successes. They can have great problems, right? They emerged not fully formed out of someone's mind. They emerged in response to the problems of the era, right? So I would argue a traditional worldview emerged in response to the problems of the era it emerged in, of the ancient world. It emerged in response to address those problems as best it could in that era. The modern worldview emerged in response to the problems of the religious worldview, right? It saw there was a lot of problems there, and it emerged as a response to them, right? So traditional worldview, modern worldview starts to emerge. So what happens when modernism finally gets going? It finally gets going. It finally has a lot of adherents. We have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Modernism finally is fully birthed on the cultural stage. What happens? You have the emergence of another worldview, right? We can call this the progressive worldview, the postmodern worldview. People give it different names. Where do we first see it maybe start to emerge? So you have to understand that these worldviews, they emerge in part as a reaction to the previous worldview, right? To solve the problems, to answer the questions, the conundrums, to address the pathologies, right, of the previous worldview. So modernism emerges to address a lot of the pathologies of, of religion, which is and of the traditional worldview, which has some great strengths, but it's not very focused on, creating heaven on this world, right? In this world, it's not very focused. It's focused on heaven in another world for the most part, right? It's focused, and it has great strength. We could talk about its strengths, but it's focused on, and modernism comes along and says, no, it's about this world. We need to build this world, and we need to engage with this, and we need science and technology, and forget this ideology of religion. We need to be pragmatic, and we need to be, we need science to explain to us how to see the world, because all this stuff was happening in the medieval era, in the Middle Ages, that the plague was, and all these things were happening that the clerisy of the time and the priests of the time were unable to deal with at all. So you have this emergence of modernism. I mean, I'm giving you the very brief version. But then when modernism finally gets going, right, you have the next worldview, this progressive postmodern worldview. I asked the question, where do we see that emerge? Well, one of the first places we see it, I think, is in the Romantic poets, right? The beautiful Romantic poets. I love them, right? You see Wordsworth, right? What's Wordsworth saying? You can track the DNA in a lot of ways of that next cultural emergence and worldview in Wordsworth poetry. I mean, he nails it. I mean, you can feel it, like the world is too late with us, getting and spending, little we see in nature that is ours, right? I mean, that's Wordsworth saying this industrial revolution stuff, these cities, these urban worlds, science, progress, what has this brought us? We need to get back to nature, right? Back to the natural world, right? I'm telling you, 500 years before, people weren't saying get back to nature. They were too in nature. I mean, we had to get out of nature into the cities before we could get back. It's like, I mean, most of history, people aren't saying get back to nature so much because there's so much in it. I mean, people are just in it, you have to get out of it before you need to get back to it. But by the Industrial Revolution, we're starting to live in cities. We're starting, and you see this longing for, what's he say? I'd rather be suckled by a creed outworn, right? Meaning that, the downside of modernism, he's already seen, is it's kind of soulless. It's all about, it doesn't have any deeper side, it doesn't have any deeper dimensions to it. It's all about getting and spending and building and and getting the world. And what about the deeper parts of what it means to be human? I'd rather be, and he reaches back, not to religion necessarily, but to even earlier traditions. I'd rather be suckled in a creed outworn, right? Of course, when postmodernism and progressivism really emerges later on, we see millions of people doing exactly that, right? So he's intuiting that aspect of the worldview where literally, 100 million people started to search for wisdom in other cultures, in indigenous cultures, in 100 million people wanted to be suckled in the creed outworn, right? I mean, that was, as Wordsworth said, he predicted that. And you could see that in him. 100 million people wanted to get away from modernity with all its soullessness and et cetera, right? So, and wanted to think about nature in a different way. And we saw the problems, we saw the pathologies of modernism and its environmental destruction, right? Its lack of concern for the environment and for the natural world, right? It's focused on, economics and building this world and doing these things. And it didn't have an innate concern. It didn't see the dangers of its effects on the environment, on the natural world. And until 60, 70 years ago, the emergence of nuclear weapons and the emergence of the environmental effect, until it got really powerful, the idea that we could have a big impact on the climate or on the natural world in some negative way or on the planet as a whole, I mean, that never even, the idea of that would seem absurd 200 years ago. I mean, how could we possibly be so powerful as to do that? But over 100 years, it became true. We became so powerful through the advantages of the science and technology that modernism brought the world, that we had this massive environmental aspect of where we started to realize, oh my God, what have we done? So postmodernism and progressivism emerges to correct, the soullessness of modernism. It emerges to correct the environmental damage and the lack of concern for the natural world and for the ways of seeing the world that are intrinsic to nature. Get back to nature, right? That Wordsworth thing again. And it's got one other element. Modernism is so built by, men, and particularly European men, because it emerged primarily in Europe, become very important in modernism, right? They're the ones with the power. And over time, we start to realize that power imbalance is not healthy, it's not good, and it needs to be responded to. It becomes its own pathology, keeping other cultures, women, other cultures out of the opportunity of modernism, out of the benefits of modernism, right? And so a huge part of what progressivism offers and postmodernism offers is what we now call the social justice, world of social justice. We recognize the sins of racism and of keeping all of these people out of the bounty of modernism, out and away from the bounty of that table of modernism, right? Such an important part of that worldview that fully emerges when does it really come online in culture? You see little hints of it right here and there, but when does it come on culture? When does it really emerge? It emerges in the 60s, and this recognition that in America, that the racism of the past can no longer stand by, that the environmental degradation we see at that time can no longer, the danger of nuclear weapons at the time, the danger of technology, that is going to cause all these problems. So you see this emergence, the recognition that women need to be liberated and have a whole new opportunity to participate in life in a way that hadn't been true in previous eras, and just in all kinds of ways. And the other cultures need to be engaged and brought to the table in other ways. That it needs, that modernism have all these problems. So here we are now, right? Where we have these cultural issues. So the culture war today is no longer between modernism and traditionalism, right? You saw a little bit of it after 9/11 when you have all the new atheists going after the traditional religion, right? So that was the old culture war, right? But not today. Not today. The culture war, for the most part, is progressives and postmoderns saying trying to make a space for themselves, either fighting modernism or even more often fighting traditionalism. So let's look at the way culture looks today in our current world. Now, I got this from my co-founder of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, Steve McIntosh. He has this good chart here. So this is a very rough sense of how our culture looks today, right? And you got 30% of the country, this is the US, is roughly in a traditional worldview. Now, by traditionalists, I don't mean they're just like they were in 800, but I mean, it's obviously be very influenced by later generations of modernism and progressivism. Everyone is influenced by what has come in culture, but in still some fundamental way, they're more religious. They're more focused on family. They're more focused on some of those traditional values, what we call family values. You know, we have these terms in culture that sort of represent these kinds of worldviews, these ways of organizing reality. And you have the modernists, right? And the modernists are something like 50% of the country, right? So the modernists don't have a political party on their own. They split. Kind of, you have a version of modernist that's more democratic. You have a version that's more Republican. And the progressives have sort of come online and slowly built cultural momentum since the 60s, right? Slowly built cultural momentum. And in these three fronts, progressivism has three fronts it's emerged in, right? One is in the world of environmentalism and ecology and trying a new form of environmentalism and ecology to respond to the damages of modernism. One is in social justice, right? All the things I said about the emergence of social justice and the recognition of how important it is. And one is in consciousness, right? Meaning that we have to form a new way, a new spirituality, a spiritual but not religious, right? Spiritual but not religious, progressive, not traditional, right? Spiritual, not religious, a new form of spirituality, a new form of consciousness, a new form of subjectivity, new forms of psychology, all kinds of things, all designed to get out of our minds, get into our bodies, get into our emotions, have a deeper form of subjectivity, understand ourselves better, understand our psychology better, understand all kinds of things about ourselves better, and reach for a depth that was missing in modernism and in scientific material, what we think of scientific materialism, right? So that at least, let's say roughly 20%, these are all estimates, of the culture is fully in that mode. And that culture has tended to be very democratic, right? Roughly. So you have this modernist 50%, and you have this Democratic left and Republican right sort of fighting for that modernist middle, right? That's kind of how our politics look at this point. There's sort of an aspect of modernism that's partially modernism and traditionalism, an aspect of progressive that's progressive and modern, right? And the culture wars are mostly between the progressives and the traditionalists. That's where the culture wars are today. And in the last year or so, you see with the emergence of the social justice movements of the pandemic, progressivism or postmodernism, however we want to call it, has become even more powerful, right, in culture, particularly the social justice aspect of it, right? It's become, has a lot of power in culture. It didn't have that power 10, 20 years ago, right? It's become, I used to say progressivism runs the culture, modernism runs the economy. But progressives are starting to make inroads into the economy too. They're starting to have influence on those boardrooms, right? They're starting to have influence. So this is how our politics look today. Now, each of these worldviews, and particularly progressives and traditionalists, they're not crazy about each other, right? They're not going anywhere. Each of them really wants to get rid of the others. They'd really, in some ways, they don't want to live with the others to some degree, right? People move into their tribes, right? You could see a situation where there's almost a kind of a non-violent, but nevertheless very real civil war right now between progressives and traditionalists, right? And modernists kind of are in the middle of some of their work. It's an issue in culture. We are more polarized than we've been probably any time since the Civil War. And I started with what I was saying partially because I wanted to understand how to deal and respond to this kind of situation in culture. It's important to understand, it's important to do at least two things, right? You got to be able to think in a more complex way so you can see that progressivism is not all good, traditionalism is not all bad, or vice versa. There are healthy aspects that we need of traditionalism. There are healthy aspects we need of progressivism. We have to be able to think in non-binary ways about this. We have to be able to think in complex ways. We have to be able to see how different things integrate, how they relate to each other. And it's not just this worldview versus that worldview. It's not a Manichaean situation. It's not good and bad. It's not just A and B. It's a more complex cultural picture. And I think it takes a more, it helps to awaken our cognition to be able to picture this, what we're dealing with. And if we can see these in temporally, if we can see these developmentally, we see how one developed out of the pathologies of the other, and then the next developed out of the pathologies of the other, and how all three are still active in culture and how they're fighting. It helps to understand what's going on. And if we want to have an influence on it, if we want to be able to ameliorate it, to provide some kind of acupressure, release, or something, this is a challenge because we have not dealt with this kind of challenge in our culture in a long time, right? For many years in American culture, it was really the modernists and traditionalists. You had lots of fights, but it was those two worldviews mostly it was all the fights were in between those two worldviews. But something happened in the 1960s. This whole new thing emerged. And when it did, it cracked open American culture. It's a real Humpty Dumpty situation, right? We're not putting it back together, right? It was very good, and it has enormous consequences. It was very good in the sense that progressivism brought a lot of very good things, but it brought some very unhealthy things too, right? So what's unhealthy about progressivism, right? So let's stop there for a moment. So in order, we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together, right? Our culture is no longer integrated and unified like it was. It's broken apart. Now, later on, in the long run, we could find a new form of unity in culture, a new form of coming together that will be a higher form, that will take us to God knows where. And that could be very positive. But in the meantime, we're broken apart. We're in a period, evolution sometimes goes through periods of divergence and then convergence, right? Of disunity and then unity, it breaks apart and then it kind of comes together, right? You see that pattern in biological evolution. You see that pattern in cultural evolution. We're in a period of divergence. And that's not bad. That means culture is still evolving in many ways, but it is dangerous. And we're probably going to be in that period for a while. But ultimately, we need to figure out how to negotiate a period of divergence in culture without losing our culture, without having a civil war, because that's a possibility. All kinds of things can happen when you have this level of polarization in culture without the breakdown of institutions in the wrong ways, right? So we're in a very challenging time in American history because of these dynamics. And I mean, there's a lot of other dynamics too, but these are the ones I'm focused on tonight. And understanding these worldviews, understanding how they relate to each other, and understanding that they aren't all bad or all good can give us a leg up, hopefully, on being able to respond and hopefully help our culture get through this period without disintegrating into the kind of problem that would take a long time to recover from. So that's kind of our goal at the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And obviously it's a huge thing, and no one, we can only have so much impact on it, but seeing it through this lens is very helpful because it helps you get out of being just a tribal warrior for one of these worldviews. And that's not helping any of us. Is that so? I'm going to leave it at that for a moment and take some questions. And so I know that was just an enormous amount I shared with you there.
I have a comment, and that was wonderful. It really, just your vision of how everything fits together and isn't just a polarized thing, but, actually moving towards something. I appreciate that. I just want to put some other words on traditionalists and progressives. So to me, it's like individual values on the one hand versus group values on the other hand. And I have a friend who's a psychologist. We've just been talking about this. I mean, some other words on that are like competition and cooperation. I think I kind of like group values and individual values better because that's kind of a richer field. But
yeah,
I mean, like competition, like if you think of sports or like photography contests or I mean, there's good things that come out of competition.
Very good things.
But these people have carried it too far, and I don't know that I guess I'm a progressive, but I mean, it seems like they've also gotten very warrior-like about it. and so, I mean, I don't know. That's why I guess people accuse them of being socialist. I don't know if that they are, but I mean that socialism is kind of that the values of the group are more important than the individual. So I agree with you. Those are both really good kinds of values, but they have to be limited to the right spheres. I don't know what the answer of that is, but yeah, I like the way you're thinking very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Competition cooperation is a great polarity. I spend the whole chapter in Evolutionaries on this issue. And
okay, I've forgotten your book.
Yeah. No, it's okay. It's fine. No, it's just a great way of thinking, because you're right. Often, progressives will talk about, well, these modernists, this kind of Darwinian dog-eat-dog world of the economy and capitalism. It's winner take all, and it's doggy. It's just and that they describe it in its most in its most negative terms, right? And then modernists and capitalists do the same thing with progressives. Sometimes they say, well, they're all socialists and communists. They just want to all be, it's all the horror of sort of group rule and of kind of Maoism and we've seen where that leads, right? And that's sort of the extremes of a kind of collectivism, right? And you see the same dynamic in the history of evolution where initially with the idea of evolution, it was all about competition, and people are like, well, competition, it's all Darwin, it's all competition, it's like this is, and then over the last years, there's been this corrective where it's all about, competition, it's all about cooperation. That's how we evolve. We evolve through cooperation. And there's all this new science on the science of cooperation and how critical that was to our evolution. So, but ultimately what we have to it's like a polarity, and they're both healthy. They both can be unhealthy, right? Competition is absolutely important. You can't get rid of competition. My favorite example, I used it in conscious leadership, is I would say, why were the Beatles such a great band? It was certainly because they learned to cooperate in incredible ways, right? But if there wouldn't have been a competitive dynamic between John and Paul, I'm not sure they would have been as great as they were. That was absolutely essential. The way in which they were all competing, but not just competing to get rid of the other, competing to make the best music, to do the best they could. That drive is a very creative drive in the human character. We don't, and competition is a one expression of it. So we don't want to get rid of competition. Competition is very important. It drives our economy. Now, we don't want to let it to be the only thing that drives our economy or the only thing. Then it becomes toxic, So those polarities we have to recognize. They're not all good or all bad. We need both. We need the dynamic tension between them is what makes them powerful. If it's too much cooperation, you get some kind of collectivist cultural revolution hell, right? In China, what happened? Or if it's too much individualism and just kind of Darwinian, you just get a kind of a dog-eat-dog world, and you get an economy that only works for a few. And so we need both to be healthy.
And how do we integrate what is the prescription for this vital integration? And how is this extreme polarity somehow serving our evolution?
Well, unfortunately, the extreme polarity is not serving our evolution, I don't think, at this point. Well, I mean, I can make an argument that we have to go through this period of disintegration and polarity in order to get to the next wherever we're going. Yeah. But that it's easy to say that from 10,000 foot view. Yeah. We could end up in a civil war that could cost us 4 decades. That's the danger, I think, too. So I don't want to. I'm an optimist, but that's why it's a danger. It's a tricky and dangerous time. And I think the more we can do to avoid a civil war, to avoid some kind of great breakdown of culture, the better off we'll be. And for those of us who, like me, were very influenced by progressivism and grew up with progressivism, and my parents were sort of progressives, and I grew up in that worldview, and I've spent a lot of my life in that worldview in so many ways. Part of what we can do is recognize that for all of its pathologies, modernism is really important and really good. And that's the thing that progressives have a hard time with, right? It's very hard. Progressives, they were marinated in a culture that wanted to make modernism wrong for all its ills and all its problems and all its evils and all its, you hear it in, we have to go back before the Industrial Revolution to get back, or we have to go back to, indigenous cultural wisdom to get back. Now, I've got nothing against going back to indigenous cultural wisdom. That's been one of the great breakthroughs of progressivism, to bring back some of that wisdom. That's a positive. That's beautiful. But it becomes a pathology if we think they have all the answers and we've got none, and this is all bad and that was all good. That's a pathology. That's when it gets problematic, when we don't recognize the positives about the life that we lead, that we couldn't have this conversation today. I mean, all of the economic gains of the last 250 years, the ladder we all stand on in some fundamental and foundational way, democracy, individualism in its positives, liberal democracy, the ability to speak our mind and pursue life as we want to live it in so many ways, is so much of that is dependent upon what modernism brought the world. Science and technology, all of it, right? So part of what progressives can do is affirm that, because what happens is in some fundamental way, each worldview has a story about how they're going to overthrow the other worldviews, right? So progressivism always has a story about how it's going to overthrow the evil modernists. Now, they don't say modernists, they say evil capitalists, or they say evil, and in the consciousness dimension, they always got there was always the harmonic convergence or the 2012. There was always some moment, when everyone was going to wake up and into a higher level of consciousness and become progressives more. I mean, it's kind of this sort, right? That's the version, right? But, traditionalists have it too, right? There's always some, millennialism, some Messiah, I wrote a whole article on Messiahs years ago. There's always some story about how, there's going to be a second coming, or there's going to be some apocalypse, or there's going to be some moment in culture that's going to overthrow the soulless world and restore our religious truth, right? And I'm being facetious, but it's kind of true, right? It's like there's always a story about how our worldview is going to overthrow the other worldviews. So
that defines the first teaching.
Could I make a comment? I would like to make one. I would like to make one comment and
sure, Joe. Yes.
Ask a question. I have a question having to do with your mixing of emergence with evolution. To me, evolution just has moments of progression, forward or sideways or backwards even. So we evolve into where we are today by building on this. It's kind of like we keep filling this bin with information and data and science and technology. And that's the other piece. I think if we go back and look at history, technology drove a lot of these things to allow us to evolve to the next level. Not some giant religious movement. I mean, a lot of those were driven by the technology of warfare or travel or whatever. The need to look for food. So I think what we're evolving to we have a very, very complex society and situation today because we've evolved to it. We keep adding to this bin of knowledge. It's not emergent, it's been emergent. That's evolution. That's my comment.
I don't think I disagree. I mean, I may have a few quibbles there, but in general, I think that's true. I mean, I think that one of the things I did a little bit in Evolutionaries, but one of the things I don't have the slide here today is that, you can track the evolution. Okay, first of all, Michael Murphy, who's the founder of Esalen, has this great line, and it's so true. He says, evolution meanders more than it progresses. Right. So, and that's true of biological evolution. That's true of cultural evolution. I interviewed this, one of my favorite thinkers, Robert Wright, who wrote a book called Non-Zero. And he has this great line where he said, look, if you went like 1 billion years ago and you were in some alien from another planet and you came every 100 years and you checked in with the human race, not the human race, with biological life on the planet, and you just came here every 100 years for like a long time. And, in general, evolution would look, you could see a progression of evolution. Now, there might even be disasters that would interfere with that for 100 years. Maybe the dinosaurs might die off and you might come and say, wow, something happened. It's not like it was. But in general, life was evolving. It was growing more complex. The capacity of life for cognition and our brains were growing in size in various ways. If you checked in every 100 years, you could see some progression, but it also meanders a lot. It might detour for 50 million years. You might not. And cultural evolution is a little bit like that too, right? It can take all kinds of weird forms temporarily, and it can detour, it can step back, it can do all kinds of things. So there's no straight line of evolution. There's no perfect, just straight on. That doesn't exist. And I don't pretend it does. Sometimes you have to take huge steps back before you can take steps forward. That is true too. And we may be in a period where we end up something like that is happening. You could argue, I would make an argument, this would be a whole presentation of itself, that in some ways the emergence of religion after the Roman Empire was a kind of it was a right turn in terms of cultural evolution. There are all kinds of issues with it. We used to call it the Dark Ages because we thought it was just a massive step back, right? But I would argue that all kinds of things were there was reasons why it happened, and there are probably all kinds of things that it did to culture that allowed the next step to ultimately emerge of modernists and science and technology and democracy. But it was still 800 years or 1,000 years of a kind of religious culture that all kinds of problems. It's like in a more conscious culture, I don't want to go through 100 years or 500 years of a very repressive culture in order to take the next step. I want to be able to take the next step sooner. And evolution, like you said, because of technology, because of our global world, because of this intermixing of cultures, it's speeding up fast. It is speeding up. It's faster and faster. We've never been able to have all cultures in the world online at the same time. We've never had all these different worldviews online at the same time. It's presenting, that's the challenge that's the challenge that integral and evolutionary is emerging to respond to. That's the great challenge of our time. And we need a more complex level of cognition to respond to it. We need a deeper understanding of human culture to respond to it. So I would argue that that's part of what we're trying to participate in, to bring that forward as best we can. Is that I don't know if I responded exactly what you're saying, but at least it's a little bit. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, I
No,
think
that's fine.
I agree with you in the sense that I mean, what we try to do is we try to put labels and boxes on it to explain it, because quite honestly, it's beyond us. It's like the economists trying to measure the economy and saying, well, yeah, but look, the trend we had in the 1980s. Well, the 1980s don't mean anything compared to today with the internet and the speed of transactions and
Sure.
the world economy. So you can't just, it's difficult to explain any of these problems because we can't even measure them. We can't even identify all the variables that are impacting us socially, economically, climate. We don't even know how to measure the climate, really. We're doing the best we can, and every day we get more information, which shape the foundation of what we get comfortable with. Some of us can adapt to that. Some of the deplorables can't. They just can't handle it.
But that's okay. But yes, I agree with that. Traditional worldviews weren't, they weren't really designed to live in complex global worlds. But people are going to be in traditional worldviews for the near future, and we have to get okay about that. That has to be okay. We have to find ways for that to be okay. That's something that's a challenge for progressives and even for modernists. That we can't expect people to evolve in all kind, to be as enlightened as we are. Like you said, people are going to be or enlightened as we may think we are. But part of this cultural turn is recognizing that despite the fact that, like you say, maybe certain aspects of a traditional worldview, let's say, aren't really designed to live in a modern age, in at least in the global information age, we also can appreciate that they bring things to the table that are also really healthy, that we may have lost, that we may have, and it is recognizing the dignity of each of these ways of living and of thinking and acting, despite their pathologies. That is something we can do. And that's something that does potentially ameliorate the culture wars. And I think we all can model that and work to do that ourselves. And part of how we do that is by understanding, what my colleagues likes to say, the dignities as well as the disasters of traditionalism and modernism. Modernism had a lot of dignities. It brought the world into where we are now. It has some disasters. It has the challenge that it could destroy the planet in multiple ways. It could fuck up human life in all kinds of ways. We've never had that before. That is because of modernism, but it's also brought us everything that we take for granted. So it's by appreciating both of those, whereas if we are progressives and we are fighting, let's say, for climate, and our method of fighting for climate is to get rid of modernism, just in capitalism, this that isn't going to work. You're enacting a tribal conflict, right? You're enacting a tribal conflict. And what we're trying to do is de-enact these tribal conflicts. We're going to disagree, but if modernism or traditionalism or progressivism feels under threat at an existential level, that's when you get the culture war. That's when you get civil wars, right? Ultimately, you see this with traditionalists too. I've been harping on progressives because I know most of us are more progressive in some ways. Me too. So I tend to go after progressives a little bit in this issue because I feel like they're that's who I can speak to. But, traditionalists do this all the time. I used to joke that Rick Santorum used to say, Satan was loose in our schools, right? Well, I mean, for traditionalists, progressivism is sort of the equivalent of Satan. It's like that worldview is like, to them, it's like that's a version of, that will lead you off the path. And he'd say, and he's right. Progressivism run American universities. They are in control of American universities. So he's right at that. It's just not Satan, it's progressivism. But, it's like that's the same thing, So So we're trying to find ways to disrupt and ameliorate these tribal wars, which are really, they're causing. America is going through a bit of an existential crisis now because it has to enlarge itself to embrace these larger aspects of what it means to be American.
I have a question. So how can you find the dignity? How can you find dignity in I'll just put it all in one bucket. The traditionalists who are racist and misogynists and bigots and where's the dignity in that? Right now, there is so much racism. There's always been racism in America, but there's been like a new emergence in the last 5 years or so of a new sort of racism and a pushback against the patriarchy, the white patriarchy, if you will. Where is the dignity in honoring, in feeling charitable toward that sort of thing?
Well, I don't think you have to feel, no one's asking anyone to feel charitable toward some toxic expression of a racism that we move beyond, right?
I think one thing that helps me when I consider those kinds of, toxic attitudes is many years ago, I attended a talk by Matthew Fox, and somebody asked him a question about fundamentalism. And they said, can you say something about fundamentalism? And he said, fundamentalism on any level, whether it's religious or political or whatever, is a fear reaction to the perceived chaos of our time. And that helped me tremendously because I was struggling myself at that time, with feeling tolerance regarding the intolerance of religious fundamentalists, right? And I realized that if it is a fear reaction, which I really think it is, then I can't be angry at someone for being afraid. I can only, seek to help them, assuage their fear somehow, to help them. And it's a struggle, but I think, it's like the Dalai Lama says. He says everyone, without exception, is trying to be happy and avoid suffering. And I think that we just have a lot of crazy strategies to that end. But if I can remember that someone's destructive behavior is their strategy for, being happy and avoid, so this is how they think, this is what they think is going to make them happy and to, help their pain, then, I don't have to allow it. I still have to stop it if it's hurting someone, but I can feel compassion rather than hatred or bitterness. Those perspectives just help me to, to not go into toxic emotions myself.
That's a great advice. I totally support that. I mean, I think that's fantastic advice. And I would add, I guess in this piece, I would add that, race is its own issue in America, particularly, but part of it is recognizing that there are aspects of a traditional worldview in the midst of that are healthy, natural, that have a place, the attention on family, on community, sometimes on discipline, on a certain kind of way of a certain type of self-development that can be very important in evolutionary terms. There's a sense of transcendence, a sense of God and transcendence. There's a beauty to that worldview in its own way, even if you and I don't share it in the same way. There can be a beauty to it. Now, obviously, we know that those there can be a kind of ignorance and racism that can certainly go along with that in America, but you have to look at it from the perspective of the traditional worldview that was going along and living life. Not necessarily, some of it was racially advantaged, sure, but not necessarily, not all of it. I disagree that all of it was racist or anything. And you have this progressive worldview come along and start telling you you're kind of bad and evil and you're what's wrong with the whole world. And you start doing that to people. And even if there are things that are wrong with you or your community or your tribe and the things that need it, you start attacking a whole cultural structure like that, they are going to fight back. Whether or not it's racially motivated or it has nothing to do with race in some cases, they're still going to fight back and they're still going to react. I'm not saying anyone's acting poorly here. Well, some people are acting poorly, consciously poorly, but that's kind of what happens. That's part of how evolution happens. Let's be honest. A new worldview emerges. It has to find its place, right? It has to make the other worldviews wrong, right? Just like kids, right? Kids have all kinds of ideas about their parents, right? And how wrong their parents' worldview is, right? It's very easy to make their parents wrong about all kinds of things, right? And then maybe as we mature, we realize, well, maybe we weren't so wise as we, and yeah, there were things that were wrong about my parents' worldview, but there were also things that were good, it wasn't all wrong. And so traditionalism, we have to acknowledge that there are, so yes, so the racial element, I guess the one area where I maybe would disagree with you is while I think race has come alive in American culture as an issue and the need to make further progress much faster has come alive. I don't think America is more racist now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I think we've made nothing but progress really over the last 50 years. That doesn't mean there's not a long way to go. And that doesn't mean the issue isn't up for discussion in a way it hasn't been over the last 5 or 10 years. And that it's happening in the midst of this massive culture war. But I think one of the toxic aspects of progressivism is when it turns, when it doesn't just want to be corrective, it wants to be revolutionary. When it doesn't want to improve American culture and make it much, much better and healthier and continue to make progress in these areas, it wants to overturn it fundamentally and say, America is just a racist society, full stop. You go from a healthy improvement potentially to a more problematic overturning of an attack on the institution itself and the country itself. Or what that really is saying, see, what's happening there at some existential level is you're saying modernism is really responsible for racism in some way. And we need to overthrow modernism, and America is sort of associated with modernism. And so we need to overthrow it in order to get to a non-racist future. I appreciate the spirit of wanting to get to a non-racist future. I think you're going about it in a way that's not going to have that effect. And it has its own toxicity because you're not understanding these cultural dynamics. Does that make sense? I know that's a slightly complex picture.
There's been this movement, I don't know when, or about people talking to each other, particularly after Trump got elected. I actually did try that, talking to Trump supporters. I mean, some of them are okay, actually. So is that part of what your center is doing? Because, it's we have to see the other. I think those are...
You have to see the other, no doubt. A lot of people are doing that, and I think that's great work. I know some of those groups that are doing that. I think that work is empowered if we can actually see the dignity in other people. Again, we don't have to excuse racism or things like that. We don't excuse any of that. but we can still, and look, there are racists out there. They should just be, canceled. They should be. It's okay. But there's a lot of collateral damage that can happen in these culture wars, where and that's the damage we don't want. And the way we avoid that damage is by distinguishing between those toxic aspects and the dignities, and not just throwing everyone into the same bucket, because that is not a way, and look, obviously part of what happened with Trump is, a huge part of the culture felt unseen and left behind, and he tapped into that. He knew that. Yeah, there was a racial element to it, no doubt. And there's but I don't think that's all that was going on. That, and if there's any positive about what happened, is that a huge part of the culture was actually kind of being left behind, and we have to recognize that and find a way to go forward that actually sort of doesn't do that and integrates a lot more people into the picture of the future that we're trying to create. And I think in some ways, my hope is that does happen. It doesn't mean we're going to integrate a bunch of racists into that future, but it does mean there's a big part of the culture and that is being left behind, and we can find ways to bring more dignity to that group of Americans in ways that wasn't happening before. And I do think that is a positive. So, and part of the way we do that is by pulling apart these dignities and disasters, and appreciating and recognizing when people say, "Oh, I see, you're conflating the two. You're conflating the dignity and disaster. You're conflating the healthy and the toxic." And when you do that, it's very hard for people on the other end to say, "Oh, they just react," because they feel like they're being attacked, and they're also not going to distinguish between these two. They react, and then the other person reacts, and then we're 10 years down the culture war, and no one even remembers the initial things that got it started. So that's what we're trying to ameliorate. And there's no doubt, being in the room with people, talking to people, it reminds you, of our common humanity. But sometimes you can be in the room with people and you realize, God, we're really different. But different. We're going to have to be more okay about more different in America for a while, because we're different. We are really different in a lot of ways. We're not all the same. That's okay too,
Okay, well, I think this conversation could go on for another 2 hours, but we're currently out of time. But it's been, a lot to think about. So I want to thank all of you who attended, and especially I want to thank Carter for giving us his time and his expertise and his evolutionary worldview.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. I think I have this thing at the end. If people are, yeah. So that's in the book. If that's the Institute, if people are interested. And I also have a podcast. If people want to follow my podcast, they always can.
And the website is fascinating. That new website.
The new website is called the Post-Progressive Post.
Right. It's
so
really
it's trying to go beyond progressivism, but in this way I'm talking about, in a way that isn't anti-progressive in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
But is still trying to include progressivism in a larger vision of the future of America.
Yeah. So check it out, guys.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the good questions. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.
Carter. Thank you.